On this program, just about every day since President Trump was sworn in, we've been telling you about the president's ignoring both the rules and the norms that govern Washington, but also his seeming disdain for the very Constitution and the rule of law. Sadly, President Trump seems not to have gotten our message, so perhaps he will listen instead to one of his favorite experts from his favorite network.
When Donald Trump imposes a sales tax on items from China, when he builds a wall at the Mexico-Texas border using funds that the Congress denied him, but he takes the funds anyway, he is merely using the power that Congress has given to him and former presidents in violation of the Constitution. When that happens, when Congress throws up its hands and says, let the president do it, that's dangerous to our liberty. When Congress lets presidents write their own laws, then he's not a president, he's a prince.
Judge Napolitano, he's throwing a flag on Trump's border emergency to fund his wall, funding Congress that they had previously specifically rejected. Trump using the emergency to take billions of dollars from military projects and use it instead to pay for the wall he said that, yes, Mexico would pay for. And there's more, a lot more, like the White House's refusal to allow Congress to conduct oversight, ignoring subpoenas from multiple committees, a rule laid out for Congress, by the way, in the Constitution. Trump has also avoided Congress altogether by naming 15 acting officials to run key departments and agencies, including White House Chief of Staff, National Security Advisor, Secretaries of Homeland Security and Labor, plus National Intelligence, ICE, Customs and Border Protection, FEMA, and more. Not to mention all the emoluments issues. That's money that Trump's companies collected from foreign nations and groups who stay at Trump's hotel in D.C., his push to have the next G7 summit at his golf resort near Miami, the vice president and some Air Force flyers going out of their way to spend tax money at other Trump properties in Ireland and Scotland, and a whole lot more. All of which are just some of the reasons the House Judiciary Committee is set to move tomorrow on a new set of investigative procedures designed to essentially turn their hearings into an impeachment inquiry. The resolution says the investigations are to determine whether to recommend articles of impeachment against President Trump. For more, we turn to Steven Mulroy. He's a former federal prosecutor and now a law professor at the University of Memphis. Steven, good to talk to you again.
Yeah, likewise.
Is it hyperbole to say we could be looking at a constitutional crisis now?
I think a constitutional crisis, if not already present, could be present before you know it. And you've already, listed a number of different instances in which this particular administration is pushing past boundaries of both law and norms that we've had for many, many years, the cumulative effect of which seems to be sending a message that this president might view that the normal restraints on executive power don't apply to him.
You know, Stephen, I've often marveled at the brilliance of the founding fathers in terms of how they crafted, obviously we have the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the foresight they had, and others really at the birth of our nation. But did they not foresee that we could have a person like Donald Trump sitting in the Oval Office? Did they expect certain norms that, for well over 200 years we've had, but now all of a sudden we're in a whole new chapter of history?
Well, the framers obviously did anticipate that. They talked about it a lot. They were very afraid that a president might become a tyrant, and they had just done a revolution to throw off one tyrant. And that's why they put checks and balances into the Constitution, including significantly impeachment, which they did not anticipate, using only if there was smoking gun evidence of specific violations of federal criminal statutes. It was really to be used for any kind of abuse of authority, whether it was technically illegal or not. I think that over the years, Congress may have become a little bit too timid, a little bit too willing to delegate power to the executive, as you heard Judge Napolitano say in the clip a minute ago, and perhaps a little bit too reluctant to exercise some of those powers, including impeachment, that the framers intended to be a check on executive power run amok.
And that was my next question, because Congress is supposed to be a co-equal branch. You mentioned those checks and balances. It seems as if they certainly have ceded in the last 3 years, maybe because of all the fire hose of daily, heretofore unprecedented things this president has done. But Stephen, have they been derelict, Congress, in throwing a red flag here and saying, no, Mr. President, you've gone too far? Do they have more authority than impeachment to try and stop some of these things?
So a couple of things. First of all, this is a process that's been building for decades, particularly since World War II. Presidents have become more and more imperial, especially in foreign policy matters. Congress has allowed that to happen. Congress has passed a number of statutes, including the tariff statutes, that delegate broad powers to the executive in a way that they hadn't done before. President Trump just accelerated the process by taking those grants of power and then even pushing past their normal limits. A perfect example is the wall, where Congress had specifically rejected that budgetary item, and President Trump is now trying to use statutes that were designed for military emergencies to pursue his domestic immigration agenda with respect to the wall on the southern border. Has Congress not been sufficiently aggressive in recent years in pushing back? I think you can make a very strong argument that's the case. In recent weeks, we've seen the House become more aggressive in issuing subpoenas and then in going to court to enforce those subpoenas, which is, I think, appropriate because the framers did anticipate a robust investigatory power on the part of the House against the president. But I also think that it's maybe time for the House to get a little more serious about holding an actual impeachment inquiry, particularly in light of the evidence that's come to light after the Mueller report.
First off, I get this question a lot. Well, if they issued a subpoena and the president basically ignored it, what are they supposed to do? To that end, there's been multiple subpoenas that have been ignored by the president, interview requests also that were ignored by the president. Why has there been no downside? It seems all of a sudden that the bluff was called and there really was no downside for the president to just say no.
There are only two means of enforcing the subpoena. The political one, shaming him into compliance, and that hasn't worked because all he cares about is his base, and there is a base of 30-something% of the American people. For them, it doesn't matter what the legalities are. They're going to support Donald Trump. And the Senate, of course, as being controlled by Republicans, is going to be loyal to him and not push back. So the political lever isn't working. So that leaves the legal lever. And that's what we're seeing in process right now. And the administration has done a very good job of slowing things down and tying up the legal process. But you've seen recently, court after court has, when they finally did get to the merits, have started to rule that these subpoenas are proper and the administration needs to stop fighting them.
Explain for the audience why, when they hear impeachment, they also have to use the word inquiry in here, because in many ways, finally, a lot of these actions we put on trial. Talk about the power, if Congress chooses to move ahead with an inquiry, that they would have, and also what it would look like, and what are possibly some of the things that we could learn.
So the House itself, by itself, without cooperation of the Senate, has the power to begin an impeachment inquiry, which means that there'll be an investigation and there'll be public hearings and testimony, and the results of that investigation will be made to the public, so the public can be educated about exactly what was happening. And then the House by itself has the power, after the conclusion of those hearings, to take a vote, and by a majority of the vote, they can impeach the president, which technically just means that he has been accused of high crimes and misdemeanors. Then at that point, the action would shift to the Senate, where there would be a trial of the president on those alleged high crimes and misdemeanors, presided over by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, with the Senate sitting as the jury. Under the Constitution, it would take a 2/3 vote by the Senate to convict in order to actually remove the president. So we've had two presidents who were impeached in our nation's history, Andrew Johnson, successor to Abraham Lincoln, and Bill Clinton, but neither of them were removed. Neither of them had a conviction in the Senate. The process itself, though, whether or not, whatever happens in the Senate, arguably might be helpful just in terms of educating the public.
And of course, I know a lot of people may forget here, Stephen, but public sentiment at the time of Watergate first of all, there wasn't the political way, but even polling suggests that people were not supportive of impeachment, but then through the inquiry, obviously all the revelations that came out. So this brings me finally to however this is settled with Donald Trump, whether it be through impeachment or at the ballot box next November. Have we learned some uncomfortable truths in the last 3 years that we may need to have additional safeguards to either compel presidents to be responsive and also further define those clear lanes of checks and balances, the power of the purse, et cetera? Is there a time here that we modernize some things to prevent us or prevent another Donald Trump from doing what he's done?
Yes, I believe so. I think you're right. Polling showed that only 17% of the public favored impeachment at the beginning of the Watergate hearings, and that, of course, skyrocketed to well above 50% by the time the hearings were over. Have we learned some uncomfortable truths? Yes, I think one of them is that a significant portion of the public does not seem to be all that concerned about constitutional niceties, about whether a president is exceeding his constitutional authority. In terms of what to be done going forward, I mean, I think you're right. There are some things that Congress needs to do. One of them, I think, is to amend the National Emergencies Act and similar acts that have given very broad authority to the president in very vague language that a president can, sort of take and run with. I think a lot of those acts need to be looked at again and tightened so that there's no doubt where the boundaries are for executive authority.
Stephen, I really appreciate a few minutes here, and I wish it on a more uplifting topic, but nonetheless, I think you're right. If we're not in it now, we could be looking at one, especially if some desperation sets in on the president in the coming 12-plus months. Steven Mulroy, thanks for the time.
Thank you.
All right, coming up next, everybody, drug companies facing thousands of lawsuits over the opioid crisis. And one of the largest ones, it could be reaching a multi-billion-dollar settlement. Our legal panel joins us after the break to discuss that and a whole lot more.